This is going to be a slightly different video since its main point of departure concerns a review of a fairly new edition of the harpsichord music of Jean-Nicolas Geoffroy by Pierre Gouin, published by Les Éditions Unterbontes and freely available on IMSLP. You will find it if you go to Geoffroy's page on IMSLP and then click on the Collections tab. Several subscribers to my channel have already asked me what I think of this edition, and since one of my aims is to promote Geoffroy's music, I felt it was a topic that deserved a video of its own, especially considering that this free edition is pretty much the only one currently available. Overall, Pierre Gouin has done a really good job, and beyond that, this is an invaluable contribution because for the first time, a reliable edition of most of Geoffroy's works is readily available. The reason I say most of will become clear later in the video. However, such an undertaking also poses a significant number of challenges, and what I would like to do is identify some of these challenges and discuss how different editors have chosen to approach them. I should also mention that the one manuscript containing all of Geoffroy's works is not available online. Therefore, for this presentation, I have to rely on scholarly writings by authors who have had a chance to examine it. However, I hope to be able to present an accurate description of it and ultimately to provide useful information and guidelines for anyone interested in performing Geoffroy's music. I will also use music examples for demonstration, and these examples come from pieces I have recorded in the past, and I will put links to those videos in the video description. All of Geoffroy's harpsichord music survives in a single manuscript titled Livre de pièces de clavecin de tous les tons naturels et transposés, and compiled by an unknown scribe after Geoffroy's death. Incidentally, it is the largest collection of harpsichord pieces by a single composer in 17th century France. As Tous les tons naturels implies, the main part of the manuscript consists of suites in both major and minor modes on all the natural keys from C to A, plus B flat major and B minor. As far as I know, no other 17th century French composer explored so many tonalities. This main part of the manuscript is followed by additional pieces, also grouped together based on their tonality, although most of those groups are not designated as suites, and there are also some pieces that appear individually. A quick clarification, whose importance will become apparent later in the video. We don't know whether ordering these pieces into suites reflects Geoffroy's own practice or was simply the scribe's decision. There are certainly a couple of instances where a few too many movements seem to have been grouped together. For instance, a suite in A minor contains 7 gavottes. However, it is important to emphasize that the scribe did not simply group together all dance movements of a particular tonality. For some tonalities, we find more than one suite, or a suite plus an additional group of movements that appear later in the manuscript. Let's look now at some of the challenges any modern editor would encounter. Perhaps the best place to start is the title of the manuscript, since it discloses one of its unique features. If you recall, Tous les tons naturels is followed by et transposé. This means that some of the suites appear in more than one tonality. In other words, they appear transposed to another key, and the scribe provides a written indication at the beginning of those particular suites so that we know which of them appear in two different tonalities. There are actually a couple of pieces that appear in three different tonalities, but that does not concern us here. What is more important is the fact that the transposed versions of the suites are not mere transpositions, but rather contain differences that can range anywhere from small-scale changes like added ornamentation or the elaboration of individual phrases, to changes of harmonic content, or even the addition or deletion of a measure. Let me show you an example, and I'm choosing a fairly simple piece on purpose so that the difference between the two versions is easy to observe. This is a minuet that exists in F minor and then in a transposed version in G minor. And what you see there is, first of all, the F minor version, the first section, and then the first section in the G minor version. I should say here that the score that I'm using is from an edition by Mary Tilton, and I will have more to say about this edition later in the video. I am not using the Pierre Gouin edition for my examples because in his edition certain pieces in G minor are not included, and I will also talk about this later in the video. Let's go back now to the first line. As I said, on top you see the F minor version, the bottom the G minor version, in both cases the A section, and as you can tell there isn't really much of a difference between the two. The only difference really is that the G minor version is a little more ornamented. And let me play for a moment the F minor version, and I'm going to play everything a little more slowly just so that you have time to really understand what is going on. And the one thing I forgot to mention is if you look at the key signature, there are only 2 flats there instead of the expected 4. So now what I would say is that if I didn't know the G minor version, there are certain ornaments that I would have added anyway. So in some respects, the G minor version adds ornaments, some of which I would have probably done something similar. So the G minor version in this case sounds like this. But again, as I mentioned, the differences only concern these ornaments. Let's look now at the second section of both versions. And again, what you see on top is the F minor version, and on the bottom, the G minor version. You will notice once again that the G minor version has a couple of extra ornaments. However, here there are some other differences. And I would say what are the most important differences are the extra measure that each of the 2 versions seems to contain. And let me slowly start playing the F minor version, and I will alert you to where there is an extra measure in the G minor version. So here's the F minor version. And then here the G minor version has an extra measure, but here we go directly. And then now this is a measure that only exists in the F minor version. And then if I were to play the G minor version, here is its extra measure. And then here we skip the one measure that we find in the F minor version. And just so you can hear them complete, let me now play them without commentary. So here is the F minor version. And the G minor version. But the presence of such variants is only part of the problem, so to speak. When we add to that the extended range of tonalities, within the context of that time, of course, and especially Geoffroy's extremely daring harmonic vocabulary, which is something I have discussed in previous videos, a series of substantial challenges begins to emerge. The first challenge is evident already at the composing stage. For some of the more remote tonalities, Geoffroy seems to have devised his own key signatures, or at least I haven't encountered them in other composers' music of that time. For instance, for F minor, he used only two flats, A flat and B flat, instead of the usual four. And for B minor, he used four sharps instead of two. In both cases, incidentally, the key signatures he devised allude to an ascending melodic minor scale. And if you're curious to listen to these suites and see what the score looks like, I'll include links to the videos in which I discuss and perform both suites. Geoffroy also had to figure ways to notate some of the more unusual chords or musical passages in his music, again coming up with imaginative solutions. For instance, let's look at a passage from a Chaconne in G minor. What you see here are the last two lines from the last couplet or the last contrasting section of a G minor Chaconne. And I should say that in common with the majority of French chaconnes, this one is structured as a rondo form. In other words, we have a refrain that alternates with contrasting sections. And this is the very final section and the end of that final section. I should also mention here that this final contrasting section, this last couplet, is very unusual, even for Geoffroy's standards. And if you just look at this in isolation and not listen to the rest of the piece, it may not completely make sense. So I'm using it as an example because I want to alert your attention to the way Geoffroy decides to notate certain accidentals. However, I would say that if you really want to understand how this fits within the entire piece, you should listen to the entire Chaconne, and I'm going to put a link in the video description of my recording of this piece. So I want you to concentrate on the left hand, and before I play anything, I should mention that I'm going to play on the upper manual of the harpsichord because I have tuned it to quarter comma mean tone. I really think that this piece needs quarter comma mean tone, and what I find very important here is that Geoffroy's means of notating accidentals suggests that he may very well have wanted specifically quarter comma mean tone for this version of the piece. I say this version because the fact that this exists in F minor means that if we're going to use quarter comma mean tone, we probably shouldn't use the exact same one. But that's a different discussion altogether. So let's look for a moment at the first line, and what I would say is the right hand keeps doing this, so nothing too interesting for our purposes there. But if you look at the left hand, we have C sharp, but then E flat. Right? So the whole thing sounds like this. But where things get really interesting is in the second line, where in the left hand we have C sharps alternating with E flats. Now, the thing about this is that in terms of readability, this does look kind of awkward, because why don't you just say C sharp and D sharp, or D flat and E flat or something? But I think what Geoffroy may be implying here is that he really wants a true C sharp and a true E flat, which is precisely what we get in quarter comma mean tone, where, if you recall from my previous videos, accidentals have only one function. There are no enharmonics here. So in other words, what I have in my upper keyboard here is a true C sharp and a true or a real E flat. And you notice that this doesn't really sound just like a whole tone, but really this kind of strange diminished third. And when you add the right hand, you can tell that the effect he is after is precisely by using these real C sharp and E flat pitches, and then suddenly something that looks like, oh, why is he just doing this? And there's nothing really great about this. Why did he lose his inspiration at that moment? No, he is really trying to use this very dissonant whole step, which is not really a whole step at all, but rather a diminished third. And then suddenly something that looks really simplistic, one could say, actually becomes highly expressive. However, when both the musical vocabulary as well as the means of notating the music go beyond conventional practice, it poses challenges to anyone wanting to copy Geoffroy's autograph manuscripts. It is difficult to provide a fair assessment since no Geoffroy autographs have survived, and thus we do not know how accurately or how legibly Geoffroy himself wrote down his compositions. But the manuscript that has come down to us seems to contain a fair number of errors. And I say seems to contain because when we're dealing with a composer that delights in using unusual harmonies and extended chords, and who will sometimes harmonically misalign individual musical lines or use dissonant intervals like major sevenths and minor ninths on strong beats, it is sometimes difficult to know whether something is a mistake or was done on purpose. Add to that the fact that some of these questionable passages involve pieces that appear in more than one tonality, and you can begin to imagine the kinds of difficult choices an editor faces when preparing a modern edition, especially when certain corrections are likely going to be speculative at best. I showed you before a fairly simple piece that exists in two versions, just so that you could observe some of the differences between those two versions. Let's switch now to something a little more complicated by looking at a chaconne that exists in both F minor and G minor. The example that I'm going to use now comes from the Chaconne that I showed you just a few minutes ago, the one in G minor, but this Chaconne also exists in F minor. As a matter of fact, if you want to think of it in those terms, the original version is the F minor version, and then the transposed version is the G minor version. And what you see there is the beginning of the second couplet in the F minor version on top, and then the beginning again of the second couplet in the G minor version on the bottom. And I should mention here that everything in French chaconne sometimes is called a couplet. So the first couplet is really the refrain, and the second couplet is the first contrasting section. But right now, let's just call it the second couplet. And if you were to look at these opening three measures, there really isn't anything different. So let me just play the F minor version out of the two, just so you can see what it sounds like. But again, here, the differences are really almost non-existent. And I played the first notes of the next measure. Let's look now at the next line of this second couplet. And again, on top you see the F minor version, and on the bottom the G minor version. And here now we have some very notable differences between the two. And what I want to do first of all is to play the F minor version. And you will notice that in some cases, certain flats are in smaller type. These are the suggestions that Mary Tilton makes in this edition. In other words, she suggests that in those places we should be using these flats. And what I want to do right now is ignore them for a moment. I want to just play what is there, or what is there in the manuscript, without the editorial suggestions. And I will explain to you in a minute why she's making these. So you probably noticed that it doesn't necessarily sound, let's say, wrong, but what Mary Tilton is really thinking is what happens in the G minor version, because the G minor version sounds a little different, and if you were to kind of transpose it to F minor, it would kind of need certain of these flats that Mary Tilton has actually suggested. And something that I will also mention later in the video, to me also, the G minor version does sound a little more convincing in terms of the overall harmony. Let me play now the G minor version. So you can tell here that the harmony is very different. And also there is a fairly noticeable difference in the penultimate measure, where in the F minor version we do this, while in the G minor version the melody jumps up a third. And again, there are some differences in the harmony, and as I mentioned, this is why Mary Tilton makes the suggestions that she does make. Let's look now at the third line of the two versions, and here again I would say the differences are not as pronounced, but again it has to do with certain differences of harmony. In some respects, if you were to play in the F minor version, what you see without the suggestions that Mary Tilton makes, there is a slightly more major-ish quality, if I can say that, to some of the harmonies, whereas the G minor version sounds a little more minorish. So let me play now both versions and see what you think. Again, I will play the F minor version without Mary Tilton's suggestions. I should mention, actually, I did play one of her suggestions, and this is the B flat in the second measure. This actually doesn't make sense without that B flat. So I did that. And also the penultimate measure, when you get to this spot, right there, I would definitely do a trill, but again, that's a personal thing. I think the music is kind of asking for it. But again, I hope you saw the kind of more majorish quality that you have if you don't play all those E flats that Mary Tilton suggests. Let me play now the G minor version. And I hope another thing that you can notice when I'm playing this example is not just the fact that a lot of these editorial suggestions and trying to figure out whether something is right or wrong can be speculative at best. So as I mentioned, Mary Tilton is kind of using the G minor version as her guide for some of her suggestions. And actually, I happen to agree with her. So in this case, we're both in agreement, but perhaps another editor or another performer would have a different idea about what to add and what to leave as is. The other thing I hope you can notice here is parts of the daring language, the elements of Geoffroy's daring language. Even when we start the Chaconne, I'm playing the G minor version just because right now. You know, when I started the couplet, you have these kinds of dissonances, and you probably also noticed here, if you look, for example, at the bass line, the last two measures, and throughout this, there are different clashes, let's say, between what the right hand is doing and what the left hand is doing. But if you really look at each one of these harmonies and how they relate to each other, I think you can already see that this is a very unusual musical writing, especially for its time. Let's look now at modern editions of Geoffroy's music and their availability. As far as I know, there had been two editions. Had been because both have been out of print for several years. The one I'm familiar with, which is also the one that seems to have circulated more widely, is the one by Mary Tilton, published in 2007 in 2 volumes by the Browdy Trust. I think for anyone that really wants to explore and perform Geoffroy's music, this is an indispensable edition for several reasons. To begin with, Tilton provides pertinent biographical information, although not that much about Geoffroy is known. Perhaps even more importantly, she provides a very detailed discussion and assessment of the manuscript, so the reader understands how it was compiled and how the music is arranged. Finally, there is an excellent critical commentary concerning the individual pieces, their notation, possible errors, etc. Her edition follows the ordering of the manuscript, meaning that all the suites and the individual pieces are presented in the same order they are found in the manuscript. She's also very careful to distinguish any corrections she makes by presenting her suggestions in smaller type or in parentheses, using a slightly fainter type for added notes, and having footnotes at the bottom of a page. The second edition, also apparently out of print, is by Jacques Frisch and was published around 1980. This is an edition I have never been able to find, and I first learned of its existence from the article on Geoffroy in the French version of Wikipedia. It's not in the English version of Wikipedia, last I checked. While I've never seen it, I would potentially approach it with some reservations, and the reasons for this will become clear later in this video. Let's turn now to the edition by Pierre Gouin. The first thing to mention is that his source is not the manuscript itself, but rather the aforementioned edition by Jacques Frisch, something he clearly acknowledges. Now, let's put this information in context. As I mentioned before, the manuscript is not available online, so the only way to access it would be to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris and then spend countless hours transcribing that vast amount of music directly from the manuscript. Given that this is a free edition, I think it would be unreasonable to expect anyone to undertake such a time-consuming project for free. Also, again keeping in mind this is a free edition, there is no written introduction or critical commentary. We just get the music. The edition is commendable in many respects. The presentation of the music is excellent. In terms of readability, Pierre Gouin has done a wonderful job, and I would say in this regard, his edition is equally good to Tilton's. And similarly to Tilton, editorial corrections or suggestions are clearly marked either in the text itself or by using footnotes where necessary. However, there are three editorial decisions I find questionable. I have no way of verifying whether they originate from the Frisch edition, but regardless of their origin, they affect the content in significant ways and need to be addressed. The first is probably the least significant of the three and concerns the key signatures, which have been modernized. In other words, when a key signature does not correspond to what a modern performer is used to, it has been changed to conform to modern usage. Now, obviously, on the one hand, this may make the music a little easier to read, and admittedly, when I was playing the suites in F minor and B minor, it took a little time to get used to Geoffroy's unique key signatures for those two tonalities. However, modernizing key signatures not only deprives the performer of being aware of and appreciating Geoffroy's creative solutions, but also conceals Geoffroy's harmonic priorities that probably led him to devise those key signatures in the first place. As I mentioned before, Geoffroy's solutions are not at all haphazard since, for instance, in both the F minor and B minor suites, the key signatures allude to the melodic minor scale. The second editorial decision is far more significant and concerns the ordering of the pieces, which does not correspond to what we find in the manuscript. Instead of the original arrangement of the music into various suites and individual pieces or groups of pieces, Gouin's edition groups together all the pieces of a particular tonality. That means that we start with all of the pieces in C major, then move to all the pieces in C minor, etc. Short parenthetical remark. Interestingly enough, the manuscript actually reverses this major followed by minor ordering, as it commences with a suite in C minor, then moves to a suite in C major, etc. The only exception to this ordering concerns two pieces found very near the end of the manuscript, namely Rabat-Joie Charmant and Détachement de la Grande Pièce de Joie, both of which are very likely organ pieces. In Gouin's edition, they appear together as the two final pieces. The decision to present all of the pieces of one particular tonality together raises a few issues. The most obvious one is that the original suites and other groupings can no longer be reconstructed unless one has access to either the manuscript or Mary Tilton's edition. A performer who is not aware of the original ordering in the manuscript is probably going to assume that we're dealing with a situation similar to that of Louis Couperin, where the performer is expected to simply choose which pieces to assemble together into a suite, which of course in the case of Geoffroy is not entirely true. As I mentioned before, we can't know whether the ordering in the manuscript reflects Geoffroy's own practice or was simply the decision of the scribe, but I still think that ideally a modern edition should follow the ordering of the original source and let performers decide for themselves whether to observe that ordering or not. Another issue concerns a stylistic discrepancy we find in some pieces, which raises the possibility they may not be by Geoffroy. More specifically, there is a group of 4 chaconnes, each one titled Chaconne sur 4 notes. In contrast to every other Geoffroy chaconne and Geoffroy's music in general, these 4 chaconnes are extremely diatonic compositions with a rudimentary 2-voice texture and no harmonization whatsoever. There's just the repeating 4-note bass pattern, with each note always occupying one measure and a single melodic line above that. In the manuscript, these 4 chaconnes appear together as a unit, but in this edition, each is incorporated within the pieces that share its tonal center. Regardless of whether they are or are not by Geoffroy, the scribe's decision to present them as a unit makes perfect sense because they seem to occupy their own stylistic world apart from the rest of the music in the manuscript. Including them together with all the other pieces by Geoffroy does not make particular sense. I've already alluded a couple of times that Gouin's edition presents most, but not all, of the music contained in the original manuscript. This brings us to the third editorial decision I find problematic, which is the omission of all the transposed suites. What this means is that for all the suites that appear in more than one tonality, Gouin presents only the first version. In other words, the one that appears in what I called the main part of the manuscript, that contains suites in all the natural keys of the keyboard. But he omits the transposed version altogether. In other words, the one that appears later in the manuscript. As I mentioned earlier, the transposed versions do not merely present the pieces in a different tonality, but rather, in many cases, present different readings of the same pieces, since they contain both minor and major alterations of the musical text. Of course, since this music should ideally be performed in an unequal temperament, A piece played in a different tonality is also going to have a different expressive character. And indeed, some of the differences in the musical text between the two versions may very well reflect the coloristic properties and harmonic possibilities inherent in each tonality. Furthermore, in cases where the text of the original version may appear to contain an error, the transposed version can help us determine whether or not this is actually the case. Just to give you an example, if you recall the second couplet of the Chaconne I played earlier in the video, there are a couple of details in the original F minor version that don't seem exactly right to me. Obviously, this reflects my personal opinion, but I find the alternate reading of the second couplet in the G minor version more musically convincing. And so, when I recorded the F minor version of the Chaconne, I incorporated elements from the G minor version. And in general, since the G minor version of the suite is more ornamented and contains some passages that have been more fully worked out in terms of individual musical lines, I incorporated elements of the G minor version in my recording of the F minor suite. In the Gouin edition, the G minor version does not appear at all, so a performer does not have the opportunity for a comparison. It may seem that I spent more time pointing out what I perceive as weaknesses in Gouin's edition, but I will explain shortly why I felt it was important to do so. But first, let's consider these weaknesses within the context of all the edition's positive aspects, of which there are many. So, to summarize, this is the only edition of most of Geoffroy's harpsichord music currently available. The text is clear and easy to read, and all editorial corrections or suggestions are easily distinguishable from the text. Perhaps even more significantly, the edition is available for free, and therefore, for the first time, the scores to most of Geoffroy's pieces are easily accessible to all musicians wanting to familiarize themselves with or perform his music. Seen from this perspective, the edition by Pierre Gouin provides an invaluable contribution, and I can certainly recommend it to anyone interested in discovering Geoffroy's music. As for highlighting the weaknesses, we need to keep in mind we're dealing with a kind of special case for a couple of reasons. First, not only is Geoffroy's musical language distinctive and daring, but the manuscript that preserves his works has several unique features. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, there is very little information out there regarding Geoffroy and his works. And it is precisely for this reason that I think it is important to be very clear about what this edition offers and what it doesn't offer. Because the reality is that for many musicians, this edition may very well be their first acquaintance with the music of Geoffroy, and without additional references, they will not be aware either that the ordering of the music does not reflect the manuscript, or that all the transposed suites have been left out. And sadly, even IMSLP, when listing Geoffroy's works, follows the ordering of Gouin's edition. For anyone who wants to be seriously involved with Geoffroy's music, I would definitely recommend trying to get hold of Mary Tilton's edition, which should be available in many music libraries and is also still available in the used market. In an ideal world, I wish that Tilton's edition would be reissued, and that the original manuscript would be digitized and become available online. In the meantime, we should be grateful to Pierre Gouin for making his edition available for free, and if you have never played any of Geoffroy's music, now you have a chance to explore it. There is a wondrously strange, colorful, and beautiful world awaiting to be discovered. Thank you for watching.